So we have talked about data hazards, what they are, and so what are the conditions, how to detect them. And we have also seen that to avoid data hazard between two dependent instructions, they have to be separated by at least two other instructions in ANA. Okay, so the next thing we want to figure out is how to handle these data hazards in the ANA pipeline. In the programs, obviously there are many instructions that depend on each other. The programs are not sets of independent instructions. Obviously there is producer and consumer relationship between several instructions in our programs. So when such instructions are executing in the pipeline, how does the pipeline deal with these instructions so that the results that are produced are correct, they are not inconsistent or incorrect? So so to do that, in our ANA pipeline, to deal with these data hazards, there are basically two steps. First step is detecting the hazard, and second step is installing the pipeline. It's a very simple resolution. So basically, detection is straightforward. In the decode stage, has the brains in our pipeline. So basically, the decode stage will keep track of the destinations of the instructions that pass through it. So it will remember what was the destination register into which the previous two instructions that have passed were writing, if applicable. Okay, and then whenever a new instruction comes in, it will compare, it will figure out what are the source registers of this new instruction, and it will see if any of these sources is the same as the destination from the previous two instructions that have passed through the instruction decode stage. Then there is a data hazard. So in this case, the decode stage will simply stall the pipeline for 2 cycles to introduce a 2 instruction gap between the dependent instruction and the producing instruction. Okay, so essentially, to stall the pipeline, the decode stage will pass a no op, which is basically a null instruction which does not do any useful work, to the next stage, the execute stage, for 2 cycles. So here is an example. So note that this subtract and this add, they are dependent, because the add is writing into R1 and subtract is reading R1. Okay, so at the decode stage, when the decode stage sees the subtract, it will check the sources of the subtract, which are R5 and R1. So the decode will know that the add instruction which just now passed through, its destination is R1. So there is a conflict between this add and this subtract. Okay, so it will stall the pipeline. It will basically hold the subtract in this stage, in the decode stage, and it will also hold the following instruction not in the fetch stage, and it will simply forward this add to the memory access and to the write back stage. Okay, so for 2 cycles, the decode stage will pass this no op operation to the next stage. So there will be 2 no ops or 2 stalls in the pipeline. When this add finally reaches the write back stage and it updates its result here in the register file, now there is no problem. The subtract can proceed with the execution. Okay, so this is how the data hazards are dealt with in our ANA pipeline. Now here, let's see how our time graph would look when we have a bunch of dependent instructions, right? So the previous time graph was pretty smooth. It was a very nice staircase. Now we'll have a staircase here as well, but you'll see that it's not as nice. Okay, so let's think about this. The first instruction will still have a smooth sail through the time graph, right? So this add instruction, it has no preceding instructions, so no dependencies. It will fetch, decode, execute, do the memory access in the 4th cycle, and do the write back here in cycle 5. The AND instruction, you note that it depends on the add instruction, because it reads R1 and add writes into R1, right? So it will start fetching in cycle 2. It will move on to the decode stage in cycle 3, but at cycle 3 here in the decode stage, the pipeline will detect that there is this dependency between the add and the AND. So it will hold this AND in the decode stage until the add has had an opportunity to update R1 in its write back stage. Okay, and only after this, the pipeline will allow AND instruction to move on to the execute, memory access, and write back. Okay, the subtract instruction, well, it can start fetching when the fetch is free first in cycle 3. And note that it cannot move in the decode stage here, because you see the decode is already occupied by the AND. So that's why here it will stay in fetch stage until cycle 5. It will enter the decode here in cycle 6 when the decode becomes free. And again, the decode will check whether there is dependency between subtract and the preceding instructions, right? So note that the subtract is reading R3 and is writing into R3, right? So there is this dependency. So again, the decode will hold this subtract in the decode stage until the AND has written its result in the write back stage, right? So it will keep this subtract in the decode stage until cycle 8, and then it can proceed, the subtract can proceed to the execute, memory access, and write back. Okay. Next we have the load word. So load word is reading R3, okay, and it is writing into R7. So there is no problem, because no problem between the load word and the subtract, right? So but there is a dependency between load word and the AND, but we'll see whether that comes into play here. So load word would start fetching here in in cycle 6 when the fetch is free. After this, it will have to wait in the fetch for 3 cycles because decode is already occupied until this by the subtract instruction. Now it will first enter the decode in cycle 9. Now at this point, we'll check for the dependencies. So we'll find that there is no dependency between load word and subtract, because load word is reading R7 and R3. Subtract only writes into I'm sorry, load word is reading only R3, and subtract is writing in R7. So there is no problem between load word and subtract, but load word reads R3 and this writes into R3. Okay. However, note that the write back of AND has already happened in cycle 8, and we are already in cycle 9 here. So write back for AND has passed. There is no problem. No need to wait for the AND instruction. So the load word can proceed, no problem, into the execute, memory access, and write back without any stalls. Okay. Next, we have the store word instruction. So the store word can start fetching here in cycle 9. This is where the fetch becomes free, because until cycle 8, it is occupied by load word. Then it can move on to decode here. And now we will check whether there is any dependency. So store word needs to read R7 and R3, right? And note that this load word is writing into R7. So there is a dependency between store word and load word. Okay. So again, the store word has to wait until the write back of load word happens, right? So the decode would stall this store word until cycle 12, and then it can move on to execute, memory access, and write back. Finally, we have this LUI instruction, which will both read and write into R7. So it will first start fetching here in cycle 10, but it stays in fetch because until cycle 12, because decode is busy. It enters the decode in cycle 13, and now we will see whether there is any problem, right? So store word only reads R7, right? And load word, it writes into R7. So there is a potential data hazard between LUI and load word. But again, note that the write back of load word has already happened here in cycle 12, right? And we are already in cycle 13 here. So no need to wait for write back of load word. We can simply proceed with the execute, memory access, and write back for the LUI instruction. Okay. So all these instructions will finish in cycle 16 over here. This is a sequence of 6 instructions, most of which depend on each other. And we completed this time graph, and we see that because of these dependencies, which result in data hazards, we are no longer able to finish one instruction every clock cycle, even after the pipeline has been relatively full, right? So for example, here you see we finished the first instruction in cycle 5, the next instruction finishes in cycle 8, then cycle 11, 12, 15, and finally in cycle 16, right? uh, so these gaps that we see here in instruction completions, that is the result of the data hazards. So recall, to resolve these hazards in ANA pipeline, we saw that two dependent instructions in the pipeline should be separated by at least two other instructions, and then there is no problem, because the producing instruction would have enough time to update or write its result in the destination register. So to work around these data hazards in the ANA pipeline, whenever the decode unit detects that an instruction depends on the result of any of the two previous instructions which passed through the decode stage would stall the pipeline. So essentially what that translates to is basically these additional stall cycles that we see here in this time graph. Okay, so these are wasted cycles where no work is being done. We are just waiting for the producing instruction to update its result in the destination register. So because of this, as you will see, the CPI, which was originally close to 1, would now go up, right? So you see for this particular example, The total number of instructions that we have is basically 6, right? So recall that CPI is basically number of cycles divided by number of instructions. So in this case, number of cycles that it takes to finish this sequence of 6 instructions is basically 16. This is where all the instructions finish. So the CPI is 16 divided by 6, which is 2.67. Okay. Now recall one of the earlier examples where that we saw for the time graph, where there were no data hazards, and we could finish one instruction every cycle after the pipeline was full, ignoring the startup delays. The CPI for the pipeline was 1. Okay. So the important thing to remember from here is, whenever there are hazards in the pipeline, the CPI of the pipeline would go up because of the stalls in the pipeline. If the CPI is high, it basically implies that every instruction is taking greater number of clock cycles to finish, so which basically translates overall to a slower, relatively slower execution of the program. All right, so we are done with the data hazards. The next thing we want to talk about is control hazards, right? So what is control hazard? A control hazard basically happens in an ANA pipeline anytime we encounter a branch instruction or a jump instruction. So for instance, let's assume that we have a program, and let's say the program has a branch instruction be easy, followed by an add instruction, then a subtract instruction, let's say then a logical or, then a load word, store word, and so on, right? Let's say this is the sequence of instructions. Now let's assume that if this branch is taken, then we need to jump to this load word instruction if the branch is taken. However, if the branch is not taken, obviously the next instruction we'll execute is the add instruction. Okay. But recall, in the ANA pipeline, the branches are finally resolved here at the memory access stage. Okay. So basically this be easy, let's say when it is fetched, and let's say it is first detected that we have a branch instruction in the decode stage. We still don't know, when this branch instruction is in the decode stage, the fetch stage doesn't know whether the next instruction is going to be this add instruction or this load word instruction. Okay. And this information would be known only after this branch is resolved, when it reaches this memory access stage. Okay. So this is the problem, this is the control hazard. Until the branch is resolved, which is much later in the memory access stage, the instruction fetch stage does not know where to fetch the next instruction from. Is it going to be the sequentially next instruction, or is it going to be the one at the target address, for example, the load word here? Okay. So this is control hazard. The control hazard, the same thing is also summarized over here. Essentially in ANA, anytime we encounter a BEZ, the BGZ branch, or the JALR jump instruction, it's a control hazard, because we don't know until the memory access stage of the branch instruction where the next instruction after the branch instruction should be fetched from the sequentially next address or from the target address. So that's the control hazard. Now, how do we address these hazards in the ANA pipeline? So, well, a naive way of addressing these kinds of hazards is that we simply stall the pipeline and wait for the branch to be resolved. Okay. So, for instance, what we can do is, let's say this is our pipeline. We have this fetch, decode, execute, memory access, and write back. Let's say we fetch a branch instruction, and let's say here in the decode stage, we detect that this is a branch instruction, so this is a control hazard. Now let's say there was another instruction add which was following this branch instruction. So once the decode stage detects that this is a branch instruction and therefore it's a control hazard, the decode stage would stall the pipeline. Essentially what would happen is, the fetch unit will no longer forward the sequentially next instruction to the decode stage. This will be stalled. Okay. What we will do is, we'll simply so this won't happen immediately. We'll simply forward this BEZ, the branch instruction, to the execute stage and to the memory access stage. Okay. And we'll wait until this end of this memory access stage for this branch to resolve. At this point, when the branch is resolved, we'll know whether it is taken or not. Okay. And depending on its resolution, we will fetch either the sequentially next instruction, let's say, which is added in this case. And if it is I'm sorry, if it is not taken, then we will execute the add instruction in this case. If it is taken, then we will jump to the target address and fetch from there, right? So let's assume that the target address had this load word instruction, right? So this would be fetched and then this would be forwarded. In the meantime, when we were installing the pipeline, basically the fetch will simply pass a no op, keep passing no op to the later stages of the pipeline. Okay, so here is a animation illustrating the same process. Now this exactly the same stall process would be followed by the ANA pipeline regardless of whether the branch is taken or not taken. So let's assume we have a branch instruction, this BGZ instruction, and an add instruction that follows it. The decode stage in our pipeline has the intelligence. So it is the decode stage which will first detect whether this is a hazard or not. So in this case, when it checks the opcode, it sees that this is a branch instruction, so this is a control hazard. In response to this control hazard, the pipeline will hold this subsequently next instruction in the fetch stage, and it will simply forward this BGZ to the subsequent pipeline stages for its resolution in the memory access stage. So the fetch stage will basically forward a no op to the decode stage in the next cycle, and note that we have held add back into the instruction fetch stage, but we are moving the branch instruction forward, right? So it has now reached the execution stage. Next it will reach the memory access stage, and at the end of this stage, when this branch is resolved, we will know whether it is taken or not, right? So let's assume in this case that the branch is taken. So right now you see this this program counter value is PC plus 1, which is 30. Let's assume that the branch is taken, and if it is taken, the target address is 35. Okay, so at the end of this cycle, when the BGZ is through with the memory access, the target address here 35 is updated in the program counter. Okay, and so now we are ready to start fetching from this target address. Let's assume that at 35 we have this store word address, so we'll now fetch this, and the normal execution in the pipeline can resume henceforth. Okay, now let's take another example. Let's or the another scenario basically. So let's now assume that we still have a branch instruction and an add instruction follows it, but in this case we'll assume that the branch will not be taken. But you will note in this animation that even if the branch is not taken, we still install the pipeline exactly the same way. Okay, so again, when the decode stage detects that this is a branch instruction, it determines that this is a control hazard, so the add instruction would be held back in the fetch stage, and the fetch stage will basically keep forwarding no ops to the subsequent stages until this branch is resolved, right? So in the next cycle, the BEZ is forwarded to the execute, but fetch stage forwards a no op to the decode stage. After that, again, this no op is forwarded to the execute stage, and the BEZ is now in the memory access stage. At the end of this cycle, we will know whether the branch is taken or not, right? And let's assume that the branch is not taken. So the current value that is stored in program counter is 30, which is PC plus 1. When at the end of this clock cycle we determine here, let's say that the branch is not taken, we will know for sure that this is where the next instruction should be fetched from, and that is still the add instruction. Okay, so from now the normal execution of this pipeline can resume. No need to forward the no ops. Now this add can be forwarded to the decode stage. So this is how branches are resolved in ANA. Are there, and this is how basically the control. Okay, so the first problem on the class worksheet is basically asking you to compare the performance of the pipeline architecture with respect to these several different architectures, and also under different scenarios with hazards and without hazards. So for example, part A of this question is asking you, let's say you have a pipeline microprocessor, and you are running a program through this processor such that this program has no hazards at all, right? There is no data hazard, there is no control hazard. So for such a program, assuming that we ignore the startup delays in the pipeline, let's assume that the pipeline is always full. So for such a scenario, what would be the CPI, expected CPI of the pipeline? Okay, that's part A. Part B is asking uh, the same question, but now assume that there are a lot of hazards, right? So we still have the pipeline microarchitecture, but there are a number of data and control hazards in the program. So in this case, now what would happen to the CPI? Would CPI be greater than 1 or smaller than 1? uh, Part C is basically asking us to compare the performance of the pipeline architecture, microarchitecture, with a single cycle data path. So what do you expect? Would the performance of pipeline architecture be better or faster than that of a single cycle data path? And part D is asking us to do the same comparison, but with the multi-cycle data path, right? So do you think the pipeline microarchitecture would be more efficient and faster than the multi-cycle data path as well? Okay. For 1A. Okay? So if we ignore the startup delays, the CPI of a pipeline microprocessor with no hazards would be 1. So that makes sense. That's perfectly right. So recall that in the previous time graph example that we worked out in the last class, once the pipeline is full, assuming there are no hazards, we can finish one instruction in every cycle, right? So basically, you see the CPI of a pipeline implementation would be greater than 1 if there are a lot of data and control hazards, right? So recall in the second example of the time graph that we just went through at the beginning of this lecture, we saw that because of the dependencies, we have to stall the pipeline to make sure that the producing instructions are able to update the result in the destination registers, and the dependent instructions can get the updated values, right? So because of these stalls, these wait times, every dependent instruction will take more than 1 cycle to finish. Okay, and therefore the overall average CPI of the program would be great. Sense. Let's think about parts 1C and D, right? How do we decide which microarchitecture would be better, right? Now recall when we were talking about the single cycle architecture, we saw that in the single cycle architecture, every instruction finishes in 1 clock cycle, right? So what that means is essentially the cycle length has to be long enough that even the longest instruction like load word can finish its work. So the downside of this was that every shorter instruction was wasting time within the clock cycle. So we get a CPI of 1, which is great, but then the cycle lengths are pretty long. So it's not very efficient that way. So to remedy this situation, we came up with the multi-cycle architecture. So we now have shorter cycle times. So what that means is every instruction takes multiple cycles to finish, but then the good thing is that shorter instructions can take fewer cycles and longer instructions can take more cycles. So that way the shorter instructions don't waste as much time. Okay. Now with pipelining, note that we have the shorter cycle times from the multi-cycle architecture. Plus, we have a lot of instruction level parallelism. Okay, so what that means is in our 5-stage ANA pipeline, assuming that for now, let's assume that there is no hazard. So we could be working on 5 different instructions simultaneously inside the microprocessor. So essentially, we are executing 5 instructions simultaneously in parallel. So this tremendous instruction level parallelism, it boosts the overall throughput of ANA pipeline much more than the single cycle data path, which was anyway clear because the cycle lengths are smaller here, and plus we have a lot of parallelism. Okay, it is also faster than the multi-cycle data path, and again the key reason here is the instruction level parallelism. Because we are working on several instructions simultaneously in parallel, the overall throughput of the pipeline architecture is better than even the multi-cycle data path. Okay, now another thing, well, you might think that when you have hazards, there are multiple cycles stalls, so the ANA pipeline would be stalled and maybe the CPI is greater than 1, so probably multi-cycle data path is better. But note that in the multi-cycle data path, what is happening? Every instruction, we are only executing 1 instruction at a time, right? And every instruction will take multiple cycles, 3 cycles for let's say even the short instructions are taking 2 or 3 cycles, right? However, in ANA, an instruction will take multiple cycles only if there was a stall. Assuming, let's say, we are ignoring the startup delay, if there are no stalls, the CPI would be 1, right? And there for the stalls won't be present for every instruction. Typically a program will be a mix of dependent and independent instructions. Okay, so you will see some instructions which give us a CPI of 1, and then when there are dependencies, that for them the CPI would go up to 2 or 3, right? So overall the average won't be 3, it would be less. Does that make sense? Okay, so the short answer here is the performance of pipeline implementation is better than both the single cycle architecture and the multi-cycle architecture. So I hope that makes that the performance of ANA pipeline is better than both the single cycle and the multi-cycle data path. And the good news is that this can actually be improved further. Okay. Now this slide over here basically lists 4 of the popular techniques that are used in most microprocessors, modern microprocessors, to boost the performance of their pipelines, right? So the techniques listed here are data forwarding, branch prediction, reordering of instructions, which is also known as out of order processing or execution. And finally, we have the superscalar architecture that I was just mentioning. Uh, these are all really advanced concepts. We are not going to go into details of all of them, but for your information, I will briefly mention or summarize data forwarding and branch prediction on the next couple slides. So let's begin with data forwarding, right? So what is data forwarding? Essentially, data forwarding is a technique that is used to avoid the stalls in our pipelines that are caused due to data hazards. Okay, so let's recall this example that we talked about in the last class. So recall that we had this add instruction, let's say R1 is equal to R2 plus R3, and then we had a dependent subtract instruction, let's say R4 is equal to R5 minus R1, right? So essentially the add instruction is writing into R1 and the subtract is reading R1. That's why there is a data dependency here. So recall we saw in the last class that if these instructions are issued back to back in the pipeline, then there is the subtract instruction would basically produce an inconsistent result. So let me quickly remind you why that was happening. So if these are issued back to back, this is how they will sail through the pipeline. Okay, so for our purposes, let's assume that for this, so let's assume that this R1 initially this contains the value of 10, R2 contains 20, R3 contains 30, R4 contains, let's say, 40, and R5 contains 50, right? So the programmer's intent is for the subtract to use the value of R1, which is computed in the addition over here, okay, and not the original 10 that is stored in R1 initially. So the way this will progress is, recall that when this add is executing in the decode stage here, this add instruction will read the content of registers R2 and R3. So we'll find that R2 is 20, R3 is 30. And here in the execute stage, the add will perform this computation 20 plus 30, and it will come up with the result 50. Okay. However, this 50 would finally be written or updated in this R1. So this R1 will change from 10 to 50 only in the write back stage. Okay. So this is where R1 is finally updated with this computed latest value of 50. Okay. Now let's see what happens in the meantime with the subtract instruction, right? So if the subtract instruction is issued back to back in the decode stage, it will come and read the values of R1 and R5 from the register file. So R5 is 50, and unfortunately this R1 has not been updated, right? So if the subtract moves forward with what it finds here in R1, that is the obsolete value or the old value 10. And if we proceed with this old value of 10 and do the subtraction, this will lead to an incorrect result, right? That was the problem. Now here is an important insight. Note that this 50, although this has not been written into R1, this 50 has already been computed. The result of the addition, the previous producing instruction on which our subtract depends, is already present inside the pipeline. Okay, and therefore it is possible that in the execute stage here for the subtract instruction, let's say instead when we are performing this R5 minus R1, so R5 is updated, so we use 50 from there. But instead of using this 10, the obsolete value of R1, if we can somehow forward this 50 to the execute stage of the subtraction and use this 50 here as the second operand, will we not get the correct result? Now this simple insight is what is known as data forwarding. Okay, so essentially data forwarding is finding the result of a previous instruction in the pipeline and forwarding it to the execute stage of a dependent instruction. This is data forwarding. And if we have this data forwarding, note that this dependent subtract, it does not need to be stalled. It can basically be issued back to back, and it can finish in one cycle later, just as usual, one cycle after the producing instruction. okay, and with correct result, because we are forwarding the result of the previous computation and we are not using the old value from the register file. So this is a technique that is used for boosting the performance of the pipelines. The data forwarding in ANA pipeline can actually avoid all the stalls that come from data dependencies between arithmetic and logic instructions, right? So for example, if a subtract depends on an add, as in this example, these dependencies can all be eliminated using data forwarding. The same example here that you've seen here on the slide, this is also illustrated here on this animation. So I said that data forwarding can eliminate all the data dependencies or data hazards in the ANA pipeline between arithmetic and logic instructions. Okay. However, it has limitations. So for example, if there is a dependency or a stall that is coming from a load word instruction, a memory instruction, that cannot be eliminated completely by this data forwarding. So let's take this example, right? So let's say there is an add instruction that depends on the result of a load word, right? So let's see how this will play out even with data forwarding. So let's say we have load word R1, R2, 0, and we have this dependent add, which is add R3, R4, R1, right? So essentially the load word is saying that in R1, we want to, or let me make some more room here. So let's say we want to basically say in R1, we want to load the contents of memory address R2 plus 0. And for this add instruction, essentially it is saying R3 is equal to R4 plus R1, right? So basically this add is reading the value of R1 and load word is writing into R1. That is why there is a dependency. Again, for simplicity, we can assume that, let's say this R1 initially contains 20, R2 let's say contains I'm sorry, R1 contains 10, R2 contains 20, R3 contains 30, R4 contains 40. Let's assume this. Okay, and let's assume that the data that is stored here at this address 20 plus 0, right? Let's assume that the data is 88. I'm making this up for illustration. Now let's see what happens if when these instructions are issued back to back, right? So this load word will go through the fetch, the decode, the execute, memory access, and write back. And this add, it will follow. Basically, it will enter the fetch here, decode here, execute, memory access, and finally do the write back. Okay. So in this, at this decode stage, the load word would basically read the content of R2 and it will find it is 20, and it will also get the immediate, which is 0. In the execute stage, it will compute the effective address, which is 20 plus 0, 20. In the memory access stage, we'll access this memory location 20, and here we'll find that, let's say the data stored there is 88. Okay, so note that this 88, this data that is stored in the memory, it would become available at the end of the memory access stage. Now let's see what happens to the add instruction. So the add basically reaches its decode. Here it will read the content of R4 and R1, right? So R4 is 40, R1 is still obsolete, it is not updated, so it would still be 10. Now if we move forward with these numbers, let's say even though we have let's say we have data forwarding, right? So we move forward with this addition. So we can, here we'll do 40 plus, we are hoping to get the updated result from the load word here instead of this old 10. But the problem is, to move forward with this computation, the updated result, this 88, is needed at the beginning of this execute stage of the add. But this 88 becomes only available at the end of the memory access of the load word. So note that this is after, in time, the data is becoming available after when it is needed. Okay, so because the point of production, this is actually point known as point of production, is later in time than the point of consumption. This is our point of consumption. So in this case, the data forwarding will not work. We cannot forward the data in time backwards. Okay, it can only be forwarded if it is already present inside the pipeline when it is needed. So so in this case, data forwarding will not work. We still need some stall. Okay, but fortunately we don't need to wait for this 88 to be written into R1 by the end of the write back. Okay, we just, instead of installing the pipeline by 2 cycles, we can just install it by 1 cycle. Okay, so what we can do is, so let me just redraw this picture. So instead of directly moving on to the execute stage, what we can do is we'll hold this add in decode for 1 more cycle, and then we can do the execute, memory access, and write back. Okay, so there will be still a stall of 1 cycle. Now you see here, when we are executing it here, at this point, we can do 40 plus this data 88 is already present at the beginning of the execute cycle for the add, so it can be forwarded from here as an input to the add instruction. Okay, and we can proceed with the correct result. So there is one cycle stall still, even though we have data forwarding. So that's a quick summary of how data forwarding works in ANA pipeline. Now note that for forwarding this data within the pipeline across stages for different instructions, this requires extra logic. So which means there is extra circuitry needed inside the pipeline. Okay, so anytime there is extra circuitry or extra hardware functionality that needs to be implemented, obviously it will add to the cost. But in terms of performance, data forwarding is absolutely worth it, and it is broadly used it is used very kind of generously in modern microprocessors for boosting the performance of their pipelines. So let's talk about the next pipeline optimization, which is branch prediction. Okay, so branch prediction is actually used to eliminate some of the stall cycles that come from the control hazard. Recall, the problem with the control hazard is anytime we have a branch instruction or a jump instruction, we don't know whether this branch would be taken until it is resolved in the memory access stage. So basically this introduces a 3-cycle delay or stall in our ANA pipeline every time we have a branch. Now, what if somehow we could predict the branch, right? So let's say we have this sequence of instructions, right? Let's say we have BEZ followed by an add, a subtract, and let's say load word, store word, and so forth, right? Let's say this is our program. So right now what we are doing is, as soon as we see BEZ, we'll stall the pipeline, right? We'll hold this add into the fetch until this BEZ is resolved, which results in a 3-cycle stall of or wasted 3 cycles in our pipeline. So another possibility is, let's say we predict this branch, okay, and according to the prediction, we proceed with the execution, right? So given a branch, let's say BEZ, even if we don't know anything about how many times this branch is taken or not taken, right? There is a broadly speaking 50% chance that it would be taken and a 50% chance it would be not taken, assuming we don't know anything else about this branch. So if we make a wild guess, just toss a coin and predict, there is still a 50% chance that we would be right. Okay, so in ANA, we can use a very naive branch prediction, right? We can simply say, we can always assume that branch is never taken. Okay, so we'll always assume that branch is never taken. So whenever we encounter a BEZ or a BGZ branch instruction, we'll basically continue fetching the subsequent next instructions. Okay, so what does this mean? So let's think about this here. Let's say we have this fetch, decode, execute, memory access, and write back. Okay, and let's say we fetch the branch instruction here, and there was this add coming after it, right? So in this case, when we have branch prediction in our ANA pipeline, the decode stage will basically not will not stall the pipeline. Essentially, we will assume we'll predict that the branch will not be taken always, and we'll keep forwarding all the instructions to the subsequent stages. Okay, so eventually what would happen is, let's say when this BEZ will reach the memory access stage, at that point this add is, let's say, here in the execute stage, the subtract would be here in the decode stage, and the following load word would be here in the fetch stage. Okay, and then in the subsequent cycle we'll start fetching this store word instruction. And at this point, at the end of the memory access cycle, there are 2 possibilities. It turns out that the branch prediction was correct, or it turns out our prediction was incorrect, right? So because we are always predicting that branch is never taken, let's say that the branch was indeed not taken and we were right. So what that means is, we have used these 3 cycles. We have, by not waiting for the branch to be resolved and proceeding to execute the program sequentially, we have saved 3 potentially wasted cycles in doing useful work, because the branch is not taken, so we'll anyway have to execute these sequentially subsequent instructions. So we did the right thing. However, there is a 50% chance that our branch prediction was wrong, in which case at this point we'll know that this add, the subtract, these sequentially next instructions, they were not supposed to be executed. So we have done some wasted work, right? So we'll basically have to throw out this work. We'll have to flush the pipelines, and we'll have to start from the target address, right? Let's assume the target address has, let's say, an input instruction here. So we'll have to start fetching this instruction. But nevertheless, note that even if we were going to stall the pipeline, the 3 cycles were anyways going to go waste. So we, instead of just sitting idle, we did some useless work, but in the hopes that at least 50% of the time the work that we are doing would be useful. So instead of wasting 3 cycles every time there is a control hazard, on an average, if we are right 50% of the time, we'll only be wasting 1.5 cycles. Okay, so this is how the branch prediction basically works. Now note that in ANA, this branch prediction is very naive. It is always assuming that branches are never taken. But it turns out in practice, the modern branch predictors that are used in our microprocessors, they actually have a prediction accuracy greater than 90%. Okay, so more than 90% of the time, the predictions they make are correct. And therefore, what that means is more than 90% of stalls that would result from control hazards, they are actually saved. So this is a very useful technique for boosting pipelining performance. Now here is the same example, which is illustrating what happens if our prediction was incorrect, right? So let's assume we have this branch instruction which reaches the memory access stage. We assumed we naively predicted that the branch would not be taken, and so we continued fetching sequentially next instructions. At the end of this cycle, it turns out that the branch was in fact taken. So what that means is we have done some wasted work. All of this work that we have done here, this needs to be thrown away, right? So we'll basically flush the pipeline. We'll basically note that we have filled up the pipeline with these no ops, and we'll start fetching the new instruction from the target address. So this is the change that we need to introduce in the pipeline if we are using branch predictions. Essentially, there needs to be capability in the pipeline to throw away the wasted work that has been done as a result of mispredictions. So here is a quick summary of pipelining performance and pipelining as we discussed in context of ANA. Uh, if we have data forwarding and branch prediction in our ANA pipeline, the only stalls that we will see in the pipeline would be in the following two cases. First, there is a dependent instruction that depends on the result of load word. In this case, recall, there will be 1 cycle stall because load word will get the data in the memory access stage, not in the execute stage. Other than that, if there is a branch instruction, we are always predicting that the branch would never be taken. So in case the branch is taken, our prediction would be incorrect. And in this case, we'll have to throw away 3 cycles worth of work that we have done as a result of our misprediction. So that would also be a stall, effectively a stall in the pipeline. So these are the only two cases where the ANA pipeline would stall. But this is a very simple pipeline. As all of you know, this is for educational purposes. So we have made several simplifying assumptions here. In real microprocessors, there are actually many other sources of stalls, right? So for instance, in this discussion of ANA pipeline, we have assumed that every stage, the fetch, the decode, execute, memory access, write back, each of these stages are taking exactly 1 cycle. But this is kind of a naive assumption. In real microprocessors, there are several computations that cannot finish in 1 cycle. So for example, in the ALU stage, let's say you want to do a floating point operation. There is some, let's say, multiplication, division. Many of these operations, they actually take several cycles, 10, 20 cycles. They may not finish within 1 cycle. So these extra cycles for such complex instructions, they would be cause of additional stalls in the pipelines. Similarly, we are assuming that whenever we have to access the instruction memory, we have to get some instruction from the instruction memory, or let's say we have to do a load word, store word, and access the data memory, right? Read some data from the memory or write into the data which is located in the memory. We are assuming all of this is happening always in 1 cycle. Now, this is a reasonable assumption if our data is in L1 cache. Okay, from L1 cache we can get data in a cycle. However, if there is a cache miss and we have to go get the data from the main memory, this will result in hundreds of cycle stall. Okay, so again, this is a simplifying assumption which doesn't work in real microprocessors. Finally, you should note that in our ANA pipeline, we have not really talked about input output operations. These input output devices are very slow. And whenever CPU has to interact with these devices, typically that would cause several additional cycles of delay. So just to give you an idea, the clock cycles, they are typically measured in nanoseconds, right? But if you have to get data from the hard disk, depending on whether you have a magnetic disk or an SSD, getting the data may take hundreds of microseconds to milliseconds, right? So that is basically extremely slow as compared to the CPU execution speed, right? So accessing the IO devices is also a tremendous source of stalls in our microprocessor pipelines. Now, one of the thing that I would like to reiterate here is most of the advantages, performance advantages that we are getting from pipelining are basically coming from instruction level parallelism. The fact that we are able to work on several instructions simultaneously in parallel, this basically boosts the overall throughput of the pipeline. Now, now here is something that could help you in the exam if you blank out, right? So now, well, obviously you should answer all the questions after by understanding them, and hopefully you will not blank out. But many times in the exams there is a question asking for why pipelining has this advantage over that other architecture. Now, for many of these questions, the key to the answer is instruction level parallelism. Okay, many, right? Not for all. So if you don't remember anything else, try instruction level parallelism. Okay, it is likely you will get it right. So so with that tip, let me close the page on pipelining with this simple example of how pipelining actually can be used or extended to other computing domains. So in this course we have actually discussed pipelining with in the context of microprocessors. But pipelining is a very general concept which is applicable not only to microprocessors, but many other domains of computing and also many other engineering domains beyond computer science. Okay, so we at the beginning of this discussion, we walked through an example of how pipelining is used for serving customers in restaurants. Similarly, pipelining is also has been used for decades in assembly pipelines in many other industrial applications and engineering domains. If for the computation problems, you can actually employ pipelining kind of techniques anytime you have a problem that can be divided into stages, and each stage is completing a specific task towards the overall completion of the task, or basically each stage is completing a subtask, a specific subtask towards the completion of the entire task or entire job, and you can perform all of these subtasks in parallel. You can actually employ pipelining. Okay, here is a very simple example. Let's say you want to implement real-time surveillance. Oops, let's go back. So let's say you want to implement a real-time surveillance application. So you have installed a surveillance camera at your property, and you want to monitor for any intruders or any maybe unwanted wildlife. So the idea is anytime the surveillance camera captures intruders, an alarm should be blown, or an alarm should go off. So here is one way you can break down this application into stages and implement it in a pipeline fashion, right? So let's say you have this camera, it is capturing several frames every second, monitoring your property. Now each frame as it is captured, it can be fed into a digitizer, right? So the digitizer is basically responsible for digitizing these images so that they can be processed later. So that's the first stage. Once an image has been digitized, this digitized image is fed into a tracking system, right? So this is, think of this as a software which is basically processing the image and figuring out whether there are any intruders or unwanted wildlife or any changes from the previous frames that may indicate intrusion. Okay, so it is looking for such kind of hints in the picture. That's the job of the tracking software. Now, based on the processing that the tracking software does, its output can be fed into a third module, which this module basically determines whether the output, the processing results from the tracking module warrant setting off the alarm or not. Okay, so once you have, if you implement your system like this in modules that can actually work on different subtasks simultaneously in parallel, you will have a pipeline going for this surveillance task. So for example, let's say at any point in time, let's say right now frame 10. So I'm making this up, right? So let's say frame 10 of an image is being digitized. The previous frame 9 would be working it would be processing in the tracking system or the tracker system. The alarm module would at that same time be working on frame 8, which is the earlier frame, and figuring out whether the events that we see, they warrant setting off the alarm or not. Okay, so by doing this, essentially at any point in time, note that the entire system is working on 3 image frames in parallel simultaneously. Okay, so this is a simple pipeline implementation for a surveillance camera application. Now, having said that, the division of work that I have shown here, this is just one possibility. You can come up with more creative ways of dividing this job into more modules, more the other kinds of tasks. Maybe you don't want to do digitizing or tracking. Maybe you can break these down further. Maybe the tracking can be broken down further into sub modules, so that way you'll have more stages in the pipeline. So there are multiple ways of doing this. This is one possible way. The basic idea or takeaway message from this discussion is, anytime you have a task that you can break down into subtasks or stages, where each stage can be carried out in parallel to the other stages, you can implement it as a pipelined implementation. Okay, so that brings us to an end of our discussion. All right, so what are interrupts? Well, the goal of our discussion here is to first understand why interrupts were introduced in modern computer systems, how they are helpful. And the second thing we want to do is understand how these interrupts work, how this interrupt mechanism makes communication between CPU and slower IO devices more efficient. Okay, so how exactly it works and does its job. All right, so let's start with some motivation, right? So why do we need interrupts? The main problem is, in our computer systems, if we look at the speed of various components, we see a lot of diversity. So for example, CPU is basically one of the fastest components that we have in our computers. If you look at the CPU, let's say the clock cycle, the clock frequency is 1 gigahertz. That means the cycle time is 1 nanosecond. Every nanosecond, potentially your CPU is finishing one instruction, right? Now, obviously, this depends on the instruction, but let's say you have pipelining and other performance boosts, and in general, let's say on an average, the CPI is 1 to 2 or something like that. So a lot of instructions would be finishing in one cycle. As opposed to this, if you look at the other end of this spectrum, let's say IO devices, you'll find that many IO devices are extremely slow. So for instance, if you think of the magnetic hard disk, accessing some data from the magnetic hard disk, it takes time in milliseconds. So for example, 5 to 10 milliseconds, or maybe more sometimes. So the problem is, this millisecond, even though it seems like an instant to us humans, from the CPU's perspective, a millisecond is millions of times slower than its clock cycle. So anytime the CPU has to, let's say, communicate with these slow IO devices, let's say to read some data or write some data into these devices, potentially the CPU could be wasting a lot of time. So the question is, how can we make this communication efficient? Okay, so one naive way, which is also very inefficient way for the CPU to communicate with the IO devices, is shown here, right? So let's say we have the CPU, let's say it is executing a process P1. We assume that the time is increasing towards the right. And this process P1 at during execution, let's say at some point, it needs to read some data from the hard disk. So we have the hard disk over here, and let's say we want to read some data X from the hard disk. So the CPU makes a request to the hard disk for reading X. The hard disk basically receives this request from the CPU. It will work on reading X, and later on, whenever this data is available, it will return X to the CPU, and CPU can continue its execution of process P1. Now, this is a simple way of how CPU can communicate with the hard disk, but as pointed out earlier, you see this wait for the CPU while the hard disk is reading data in data this X and making it available. This wait would be wasting millions of CPU cycles. So it's very inefficient. it would be nice, or it would be much more efficient if somehow, let's say, CPU could just instruct the hard disk that I need this data item X, please grab it for me, and whenever you have it, just let me know, I will come back get it from you. Okay. And after instructing the hard disk this way, the CPU goes back and starts working on some other process that is ready to run. Okay. So if CPU could do that, that would be much more efficient, because while the hard disk is working on reading data X, the CPU could do other work. So it's not just sitting idle and waiting for the hard disk. And essentially this paradigm of communication is what is implemented with the help of interrupts. Okay. So so modifying our example here, basically with interrupts, this communication would look something like this. Let's say you have the CPU, and again the CPU is executing our process P1. At some point this P1 needs to read item X. So what the CPU will do, it will send this request for reading X to the hard disk. We have our hard disk here. And then instead of waiting for this hard disk to complete reading of X, it will set up hard disk to inform or send a notification when it is done reading. And in the meantime, CPU will go back and start executing some other process, let's say process P2, which is ready to run. Okay. And now the hard disk will also will work on reading X. At some point, at a later point, let's say here, when data item X is available, hard disk will send a notification. So the hard disk will send a notification to the CPU informing that X is available. And at this point, when this notification is received, CPU is executing this other process P2. So CPU will basically suspend this process P2. So let's for simplicity, let's assume that it happens here itself. So at this point, suspend this process P2, and then after suspending the process, the CPU will basically need to run some special pieces of code to grab the value of X from the hard disk, and then it can resume its execution. Oops. All right, so I just realized I chose the wrong option there. Sorry about that. Oops. How to, yes. Okay, so we were working on that example. So let me just do that again, right? So we had this, the CPU was running process P1. It made a request to read X. This request was sent to the hard disk, and then the CPU basically, instead of waiting for the hard disk to finish reading X, it basically set up the hard disk, asked the hard disk to read X, and whenever it is available, send a notification. And in the meantime, CPU started executing another ready process P2. Okay. At a later point, when this reading of X was finished, hard disks will send a notification to the CPU informing that X is now available. When this notification is received, at this point, CPU will suspend executing process P2, and then it will go grab this item X from hard disk and resume execution uh, as earlier. Okay, so this is a summary of how the interrupt based communication between CPUs and slow IO devices work. This notification here that was sent by the hard disk to the CPU, this is actually an interrupt. Okay, so let's now go into, with that background, let's now go into more details of how interrupts are implemented, what are interrupts, what hardware support is needed in our CPU to implement it, and then we'll walk through an example of interrupt processing. So here is a quick definition. An interrupt is basically defined as a change in the flow of the executing program that is external to the program. Okay, now note that in the previous example here, this process P2 was executing. Okay, however, during its execution, there was this interrupt or a notification that came in from the hard disk, and as a result of this notification, P2 was suspended. Okay, now this change in the execution flow of P2 was not caused by something that P2 did itself. It was caused by this interrupt that came from the hard disk, and that is why The interrupts are defined as a change in the flow of executing program that is external to the program itself. Okay. Now, typically these interrupts, they are mostly related to IO events, as we have seen on the previous slide. From the hardware perspective, let's say this is the CPU chip. The CPU has two special lines. Okay. One of them is the interrupt line. The other line is the interrupt acknowledgement line. Okay. The way this works is, whenever an IO device needs to interrupt the CPU, the IO device will assert a signal here on the interrupt line. When the CPU receives an interrupt and it is ready to serve this interrupt, it will acknowledge the receipt of this interrupt on this interrupt acknowledgement line. So these two lines are needed in the hardware to make this work. Mostly in our discussion, we'll see that an IO device can interrupt the processor in one of these two scenarios. So one is, let's say the IO device was requested by the CPU to complete or basically read some data, just as in our previous example. So in this case, when the IO device has finished reading the data and the data is now available, and the IO device will inform the CPU that the data is available, come get it from me, right? So that is one interrupt, one form of interrupt. The other form of interrupt is, but let's say the CPU has not asked the device to read something, but instead the CPU wanted to write something into this IO device. So CPU gave IO device some data and asked it to write, and then CPU went back and is doing something else. So later on, when the IO device is done writing this data, the device will simply inform the CPU that writing is completed using an interrupt. So in this case, an information is still relevant, because sometimes the CPU may not be done writing. Maybe the CPU just gave a few bytes or 1 byte to write at a time, and once this is done, the CPU has more data to give to the IO device, right? So this is still needed. Now here is the basic overall flow for interrupt execution. Basically, the IO device, any IO device that needs to interrupt the CPU, it will basically trigger the interrupt request line in the CPU. When the CPU receives the interrupt, it will basically acknowledge the interrupt. We'll talk more about that in details just in a bit. But after this, to serve the interrupt, essentially the CPU has to suspend the currently executing process and jump to a piece of code that can handle the interrupt that has been raised. Okay, so that's essentially the third step here. So that is the high level flow. Let's now walk through in some more details how an example interrupt would be served. So we'll talk about this from start to end. So let's assume that an IO device is wanting to interrupt the processor. So we'll start from there, what happens from this point. So here is our system. This is our CPU, the microprocessor. This is our main memory, the RAM. These are IO devices, right? So there are many of these. Only two are shown, but there can be many more connected in a chain. These solid lines, the thick lines, these are address bus and data buses. So we have seen that these are bunch of parallel electrical wires which are used for exchanging memory addresses, or basically data and other control signals. In addition to this, we have two other lines that we talked about. So this is the interrupt line. This is where an IO device that wants to interrupt the CPU would assert a signal. And the fourth line here, this is the interrupt acknowledgement line. Okay. So the first step is, let's say one of these IO devices wants to interrupt the CPU. So the device controller of that IO device will assert a signal in the interrupt line, basically this line. Okay, that's the first step. After this, once the interrupt has been asserted, the CPU will receive this interrupt, and whenever the CPU is ready to handle or serve this interrupt, it will acknowledge the receipt of the interrupt on this interrupt acknowledgement line. So that's the second step. The third step is, let's say the IO device receives the acknowledgement. Now the problem is, note that there is only one interrupt line which is used by all the IO devices. So how would the CPU know which of these several IO devices interrupted? Okay, so let's say there are 10 IO devices which are connected to the same interrupt line. Uh, Anybody who needs to interrupt the CPU would be asserting a signal here. So how would the CPU know which of these 10 IO devices is interrupting, right? So the next step is, for the IO device, after it has received the acknowledgement, the IO device needs to identify itself so that the CPU knows which interrupt has been raised. So to identify itself, the IO device basically uses a small integer called interrupt vector. Okay, so essentially the IO device will basically place this interrupt vector onto the system bus. We will talk more about this interrupt vector. This is actually an important piece of information that would be used for serving the interrupt. So this serves to identify the interrupting device. What the CPU will do is, CPU will basically save this interrupt vector for later use. We'll come back to this. So that's the fourth step, saving the interrupt vector. Now recall from our motivating example, we saw that whenever an interrupt is received by the CPU, it would be executing some process, and this executing process, it could be could it well it is not necessarily the same process that had uh, originated this interrupt. Okay, it could be any process, it could be the same process, but it could be a different process as well. So the problem is, at this point, when the CPU receives an interrupt, it needs to suspend the currently executing process so that it can start executing a different piece of code which is needed to service this interrupt. So essentially, recall from our example here. So recall from our motivating example. Note that when this interrupt notification was received by the CPU, at this point, this P2 was executing, right? So this P2 needs to be suspended, and then the CPU needs to go grab the value of X from the hard disk. So for grabbing this value of X from the hard disk, essentially, CPU needs to run some logic, some program, right? So this piece of code that CPU needs to run to handle the current interrupt is known as interrupt handler. Okay, this is an interrupt handling subroutine that needs to be called to handle the given interrupt. So that is what will happen next. But before we can start executing the interrupt service routine, there are a few other things that need to be taken care of. The important thing to note here is, let's say our process P2 was executing, right? Let's assume this is process P2, right? It has these several lines of code. Okay, let's say it has these several lines of code all the way from 0 to n-1. And when the interrupt was received, let's say the process was executing at this ith line, right? So let's assume the program counter was here at this ith instruction in the program. So when we are suspending this program at this point, right, we are suspending it here, we have already executed, let's say, I instructions. Later on, when the interrupt has been served, and let's say we want to resume the execution of this process P2, obviously we do not want to start it from the beginning because we have already done this much work. So when we resume this process, we would want to resume it from this point onwards, right? So the next instruction, if we have already executed I instructions, the next instruction we should execute is I plus 1th instruction and only need to do the remaining work. So to make sure that the suspended process can resume from the point where it had left off, we need to save the current state or the current work that this process executing process has done. Okay, so basically that translates to saving the value of current state of the register file, where the program counter is, what is the value in the registers, and other system information that is needed to resume the execution of the process from this point onwards. Okay, so that's the fifth step. Before suspending the executing process, we would save all the necessary information which would be required later to resume the process from where it is being suspended. This would be saved somewhere in the memory, maybe on the stack. Okay, so that's the fifth step. Now once this has been done, we are now ready to serve or handle the interrupt. And we are now ready to start serving the interrupt. Okay, so let's think about what this means. So recall that this interrupt is coming from some IO device. and there are a bunch of IO devices. So for example, it could be a hard disk, it could be a keyboard, it could be a mouse, and so forth. So an interrupt may mean that either there is some data which is available from this IO device and the CPU needs to go collect this data, or it could mean that the CPU needs to write some data into this IO device. Now, depending on what IO device it is, it would require slightly different set of instruction execution to communicate with the device. So think about it this way: the logic to write data into hard disk would be different from logic it takes to read data from the keyboard, for instance. So for different interrupts, depending on where the interrupt is coming from, there is a dedicated interrupt service routine. Okay, so we have a dedicated interrupt service routine that needs to be called for serving that particular interrupt. So in our example, for instance, let's say we have these devices, this hard disk, keyboard, and mouse in our system. So in the operating system's memory address space, there would be code for for interrupt service routines corresponding to each of these devices. So for instance, let's say there is a interrupt service routine for, let's say, mouse, that starts here, and all the code logic required to communicate with the mouse is stored here. Maybe after that there is an interrupt service routine for keyboard which begins here, and then all the logic is here, right? And let's assume that this is some piece of memory in the operating system's address space. Similarly, let's say there is an interrupt service routine for the hard disk, and it is located here. Let's assume that these different functions are starting at these various addresses. So let's assume, for example, this service routine for mouse, this is starting at memory address hexadecimal 1234, right? And let's assume there's this service routine for the keyboard. It starts at, let's say, hexadecimal 1a, 2b, right? I'm making up these addresses. And let's say this interrupt service routine for the hard disk, it is starting at memory address hexadecimal, let's say, abcd, and so forth. So essentially, each of these service routines would be located somewhere in the operating system's memory address space, and they would be starting at some specific memory addresses. So depending on what interrupt has been raised, which IO device has interrupted the CPU, one of these suitable interrupt service routines needs to be called and executed by the CPU. So the obvious next question is, how does the CPU know which of these service routines need to be called? And second, where this service routine is located. So recall that the device had provided an interrupt vector which the CPU had saved. Okay, so this interrupt vector or this integer, this can be used to identify the device, right? So for example, let's say in our example, let's assume that keyboard has an interrupt vector of 80, right? Let's say mouse has an interrupt vector of 82, right? And let's say this hard disk has an interrupt vector of 90. Okay, so by looking at these numbers, the number of the interrupt vector, the operating system would know which IO device has caused the interrupt, right? So for example, let's assume it is 82. So the operating system knows, or the CPU knows, that this is the mouse interrupt. Now the next question is, how do we know where is the interrupt service routine that is needed for handling this interrupt from the mouse? And that is where this interrupt vector table that is stored in the operating system address space, this comes into play. Okay, so essentially, as the name implies, this table will store the starting addresses for all the interrupt service routines in the operating system. So for instance, in our example, we have seen that the keyboard interrupt service routine, it starts at address hexadecimal 1A2B, right? So in the keyboard entry, this address hexadecimal 1A2B would be stored in the table. For the mouse, in our example, we have seen that the interrupt service routine starts at hexadecimal 1234, right? So there will be 1234 hexadecimal stored here in the mouse entry. And similarly, there would be, let's say there is an entry for hard disk here. So the hard disk interrupt service routine starts at hexadecimal ABCD. So this hexadecimal ABCD, this address would be stored here in this table. So the operating system simply needs to look through this table and find the beginning address of the required interrupt service routine. And here is an interesting thing. The operating system doesn't really need to search through this entire interrupt vector table. Basically, this interrupt vector which the device had provided, this can be used to index into the table. So basically, if the interrupt vector of mouse is 82, if you directly go to entry number 82, you see here 82, you'll find the starting address of the mouse interrupt service routine. Similarly, if the, let's say it was the hard disk, and its interrupt vector is 90, so if you directly go to the 90th entry here in this table, you'll find the address of hard disk's interrupt service routine, and so forth. Similarly, you see keyboard has an interrupt vector of 80, so at entry number 80 here we have the interrupt service routine for the keyboard. Okay, I hope this is making sense. So essentially, the CPU can simply get the address. So if this was a mouse interrupt, the operating system will get the beginning address, the starting address of the interrupt service routine for mouse here. It will then jump to this address, which is basically this location here, and it will execute this service routine, which will take care of the interrupt, do the needful. Let's say it needs to read some data from the mouse, that will be done. Once that is done, once this interrupt has been served, the interrupt service routine has been executed. After this, uh, we must resume the process that was suspended. Okay, so recall that in process P2 was executing, we suspended it, we saved all its context in the memory. So now we need to resume this process P2. So to do that, basically sometimes there is a special return from interrupt instruction that is provided by the instruction set. So this instruction would be executed, and this instruction will basically restore the saved values of the program counter and other system registers that we saved in step number 5 of this process, to resume the execution of the suspended program from where it left off. Okay, so this basically completes uh, the steps that are taken typically to service a interrupt. So let's wrap up this discussion. We have this slide over here basically summarizes the steps that are taken within the interrupt service routine. We have already seen this, but I'll quickly go over this again. So an interrupt service routine for the IO device will basically first save all the registers on the stack. So this will help us resume the execution of the suspended process later. It will then execute the IO device code, right? So typically this will involve the code from the device driver of the device that has raised the interrupt. So for example, if hard disk has raised the interrupt, and let's say we want to go get some data from the hard disk, so the piece of code inside the operating system which is responsible for directly communicating with the individual IO devices is known as device driver. So typically to communicate with hard disk, you need to run device driver code for the hard disk. Similarly, to communicate with the keyboard or to the mouse, you will have to run the device driver code for the keyboard or for the mouse. So this interrupt service routine will include inside it, it will call the device driver code for the associated device. Once this interrupt has been served, then the third step is to restore the program counter value and the value of the other registers, so that the original process that was suspended, it can resume execution from where it left off. So this is a quick summary of what we talked about. Here are some issues that we need to consider when working with interrupts. So in our example, it was a simple example, and we assumed that at a time there is only one interrupt. However, there are so many IO devices in our modern systems that there are multiple IO devices that could interrupt simultaneously. Or it is also possible that, let's say, the CPU started executing the interrupt service routine for one device, and now in between, in the meantime, even when the first interrupt service routine is not yet complete, another device may interrupt. So the question is, how do we handle such multiple interrupts at once? Now there are multiple ways of doing this. The simplest approach is you simply serve all the interrupts in the order they are received, right? First come, first served. So the advantage of this is that it's pretty simple to implement, but the main drawback of this approach is not all the interrupts are equally urgent or important. So some interrupts, they have a greater sense of urgency than others. The reason for this is, for example, most interrupts are coming from IO devices, right? Not all the IO devices are equally capable. It is possible that some IO device is relatively rudimentary. It has a very small buffer on board. So the problem is, if the CPU doesn't go collect the data from this IO device quickly, this data may get lost. So it is possible that this is a sensor, it is periodically collecting data, and it has a very small buffer, let's say very few bytes. So it can only store 1 or 2 words, let's say. So if the CPU doesn't go collect the word right away, it may get overwritten by the new incoming data, and the current data may get lost. So for such IO devices, they need to the interrupt service needs to be prioritized. Similarly, there are other IO devices which are more sophisticated. They have larger onboard buffer, or they may have a small RAM of their own. So the same urgency may not apply to them. So to distinguish between various interrupts according to their priorities, this first come first served scheme is not adequate. It's not sufficient. So to address this issue, basically the interrupts can be prioritized. The priority levels can be associated with various interrupts. So obviously a more urgent interrupt, let's say an interrupt coming from a device that cannot tolerate a lot of delay, will have a higher priority as compared to other interrupts. So when interrupts are prioritized, as you would imagine, basically the ones that have a higher priority would be serviced first. So the way this works is, let's say at the beginning the CPU is executing some user process. Now let's say the first interrupt comes in. For the first interrupt, the CPU would be interrupted, the executing process would be suspended, and we would start serving this first interrupt. Now let's say when we are still serving this interrupt, another interrupt comes in. So the CPU is interrupted the second time. Now if the interrupts are prioritized, basically the CPU will check what is the priority of the new interrupt with respect to the currently executing interrupt. So if the new interrupt has a higher priority than the executing interrupt, then the CPU would be interrupted for the second time. This currently executing interrupt will be suspended, and the new interrupt would start service. However, if the incoming interrupt has a lower priority, then it would be queued, and we will continue serving the currently executing interrupt. So this is how the priorities work. Now, obviously, to distinguish between various IO devices, we would need various priority levels. So, well, in many modern microprocessors, the various levels of interrupt priorities are not supported. So for example, in Intel CPUs, typically most modern Intel CPUs, they have only 2 levels of interrupt. So and those are basically maskable and non-maskable. Those are the only 2 levels. So this is maskable and not maskable, or unmaskable. So the maskable interrupts are basically those interrupts that can be turned off individually if needed. Non-maskable interrupts are those that cannot be disabled. So these are typically, this level is used for reporting catastrophic events in the system. For example, if there is a critical hardware failure, or maybe there is some error in the memory chips and so forth. So for those kinds of events, which are not very many, for all other interrupts, this maskable level is used. So obviously the problem is, with just these 2 levels, it is not possible to distinguish between several IO devices that will all fall in this maskable level, right? So to address this issue, in Intel CPUs, there would be an external interrupt controller that is used. So basically, this external interrupt controller will keep track of the priorities, and it will enforce the prioritized interrupt service as we described earlier. So that is pretty much about the interrupts. There is one more thing I would like to mention here, and that is, from our discussion, obviously you would realize that interrupts can occur at any point in time, right? It is not possible to predict and guarantee when a given interrupt will happen. So the problem is sometimes when there is some critical processing going on, right? So by critical processing, imagine there is a piece of code that needs to be executed atomically, right? By atomically, I mean, let's say there is a function that needs to completely execute in one go with no interruption. Okay, such requirements are atomic execution requirements. So for such execution, if there is, let's say you are executing such an atomic function and there is an interrupt in between, it may get suspended, and this will basically violate the correctness of this atomic execution. So to prevent such cases, Typically, in such scenarios, we may need to disable the interrupts so that they do not interrupt the atomic execution or such critical processing. You will learn more about such atomic execution requirements later on in the program. Basically, this topic is beyond the scope of our course. And finally, before closing the page on interrupts, I would like to mention that the interrupt processing also has implications on our pipeline. So imagine that we have a simple three-stage pipeline that has fetch, decode, and execute stages. Essentially, interrupts can occur at any time. And let's say we are executing a user process which is executing in this pipeline. Now, every time an instruction leaves the execute stage, we can fetch a new instruction. But because interrupts can occur at any point in time, before fetching the next instruction from this process, we should always check whether there is an outstanding interrupt that needs to be served. Okay, so there is a small change, logical change here with interrupts in our systems. Basically, in the pipelines, before fetching the next instruction, we would always have to check whether there is an outstanding interrupt. If so, then we do not fetch the next instruction from the program. We'll basically jump to the interrupt handler. If not, then we can continue fetching as usual from the executing program. So that's a small change. Note that if in the pipeline implementation, if it so happens at a certain instruction we figure that there is an outstanding interrupt, so there might be some instructions that are, let's say, in these intermediate stages, right? Maybe there is an add here, maybe a subtract is being fetched from the executing program. So we would have to squash these instructions that are still in the pipeline before we start executing the instructions from the interrupt handler. There are other advanced things that could be done, but those are not in the scope of our course, so I'm not going to talk about those here. So that basically brings us to the end of this unit and also our discussion of interrupt.